the world and certainly our personal lives would be a lot better if instead of checking things off or going through the motions or hurrying to the next thing, we took some contemplative time with the people we loved or the people who brought us into this world.
So welcome to a special Mother's Day edition of El Podcast. Today we're joined by Stuart Connelly, a renowned director, author, and screenwriter, here to delve into his latest book, Offered in Secret. Join us as Stuart shares his compelling journey of self-discovery and connection with his late mother through a 1,800-mile pilgrimage to find the ideal final resting place for his mother's ashes. Thank you, Stuart, for joining us.
Thank you. And I think I managed to get my alarms and text shut off just as you finished your intro. So hopefully we won't be disturbed. But thank you for that lovely introduction. I really appreciate it.
So, Stuart, what inspired you to embark on an 1,800-mile journey to understand your late mother?
You know, it's interesting. My mom was a little bit of an iconoclast, and she raised me the same way. And my wife is quite traditional. So when my mother died and I had her ashes, I didn't really think much of them. I knew what my mother thought, which was she believed in heaven and she believed she was going there. But what was left of her was immaterial to her. It was detritus, right? So if she thought that way, who am I to think any different? But my wife, who, as I said, is attached to the traditions of the Catholic Church, had a different view. So she kept asking me, how are we going to sort of memorialize this? What are we going to do with these precious things? And for a long time, I just said, well, it's not important to me. And after a certain amount of time, I realized that that was a little bit of a defense because she was really asking me, you know your mother better than anyone. Where would she want to spend eternity? And I had to face the fact that I didn't really know my mother well enough to answer that question. So in a sense, I was deflecting by saying, it's not important. And perhaps it was more important to me than I thought it was. So when I kind of confronted my own thoughts about my limitations as a son, I opened myself up to that question. Where would she want to be? I actually let myself hear the question and answer it. And I realized I did have an answer. And it's not that I knew her better than I thought I did. It's that there was a place in this world that I connected directly to her. And I just needed some time to make those synapses make that connection. It's not a general place like home. It's a very specific geographical place. And as I thought about the idea of geography and, that certain place, I could imagine her wanting to be within 100 feet of this certain thing. I thought how important geography plays in our own lives. And I started to think about what memories did I really have of the woman that were unique, that were legitimate, and they weren't hazy and they weren't sugar-coated and they weren't just ephemeral, but they were critical. And it turns out there was only a handful of them. And I can't speak for you and your relationship with your mom or anyone else, but my sense is that people have a sort of a general sense of mother with a capital M. But if you actually have them drill down and say, what specifics are there about your mother that you really remember? These are like urgent moments. These are times of crisis or huge happiness. And the rest is just kind of filler. And so I decided to honor my mother because I'm a writer. If I went back to those geographic places that I had those real sort of sparky memories, I might be able to learn something more about her. So that by the time I was able to put her to that resting place where the book kind of winds up in its sort of final moments, I would have a better picture of her than I ever had when she was alive. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense, Stuart. And your book came out, I believe, May 5th, so a few days before Mother's Day. Today we're recording this on May 8th. But for those that haven't read the book, are you able to briefly explain either the timeline or some highlights, take us through the journey of when you started this and ended the 1,800 miles in Syracuse, New York?
Yeah. So I'm from Syracuse. The conceit of the book, doubling back, I told you the story about my wife and I told you the story of my epiphany, but because I'm a writer, I'm also a mercenary. And as soon as I sort of got the idea to revisit those areas, I thought, well, this might make an interesting book. And in fact, I didn't know that it would be an interesting book until I completed the journey, because there were some surprises along the way. So my mother was not too sentimental, and she didn't leave behind many artifacts. When she died, she was in a retirement community in a really small apartment. And so what she left behind was the stuff she managed to hold on for years and years and years. And so when I started going through it, the photographs, the newspaper clippings, the letters, there were love letters, there were hate letters, there were letters from lawyers. And just with these few pieces of paper, I started examining who she was as a person, not as a mother. So, we talk about this as a Mother's Day book or a Mother's Day present, and we're celebrating all of May as Mother's Month. But really what I needed to come to the realization, and this may seem obvious, but for me it wasn't, that she had a whole life outside of her job as my mother. And so between the box of photographs and newspaper clippings to kind of help me orient a time frame, and the places that I had memories of, many of which were also echoed in some of these photographs, I was kind of trying to retrace the woman who became my mother and try to understand her. And in the process, come to some sort of sense of forgiveness, because the problem we have is mothers in our society, they're sort of granted this saint status. And yet people, of course, exist in the gray areas. So she was a person long before she was a mother. And as I say in the book, she was probably a better person than she was a mother. It wasn't natural. It didn't come natural to her. And when I was a little kid, of course, I had no sense of that. But now as a parent, I have twins who are now 20 years old, but watching them grow up and try to get away with things, not realizing that I thought of every lie, every scam, every trick 20, 30, 40 years before, and they thought they were coming to it for the first time. Oh, I have a fever, I can't go to school. Are you kidding me? But I think every generation, every child has to come to some kind of conclusion that I'm not the first person to try this out. This world isn't just filled with adults, and I'm the first baby to ever come along. So I had that epiphany a little bit later than most. But I think while most people understand it, and most adults have an adult relationship with their parents, there's still that sort of ick factor about digging too deep into their personal lives and what they were really like and what they said and what they thought and what they smoked, for example. So I thought it would be instructive for everybody, even though they're not related to my mother, to take my experience and kind of superimpose their own ideas of their own parents. Everybody's got a parent. And try to, hopefully if your parents are alive, you can read this and find a different way to connect with them. And if you're grieving and your mother's gone, maybe this is a way to have some idea of sort of the full circle of life. Because I'm a writer, I have the freedom to spend the time to hit the road and do these things, maybe so that other people don't have to. Maybe they can live vicariously through my story, but see their own connections inside it. So that's a long way of telling you sort of the backdrop. The events itself, my mother and I, our birthdays are separated by 8 days. She was born on August 22nd. I was born on August 30th. So knowing that I was going to write a book, I thought the way to do it would be to start on her birthday and to end on my birthday. And between those two, go to all the places, which is, as you said, about 1,800 miles, all throughout the Northeast. I grew up in Syracuse, New York. The book ends in Syracuse, New York. It starts in Wilmington, Delaware, where my mother is from. And so it's a lot of miles in kind of a big circle where I spent my childhood in different places, and there were different major events with my mother. And I recreated them and I explored them, and I tried to find her side of the story in all of them. And in doing so, I built a timeline and I built a portrait of a woman who I feel like I know much better than I did when I was celebrating her last birthday before she died. She died in September. So I was with her a week before she died on her birthday, maybe 2 weeks before she died. And I didn't know her as well then as I did when I put the last period of the last page of this book.
So how much, Stuart, did it kind of refresh your memory? You went to the house you grew up, you went to the house that your mom grew up in, and you retraced your childhood steps. I'm only 41. You're I don't know, what, 57 or whatever, but I barely remember high school. But it's like, I would think like, if you went back to the actual house and it would refresh these memories. So how important was it to actually like partake in this and go to the house that your mom grew up in, go to the house that you grew up in, or one of the houses that you grew up in, I guess I should say?
Yeah, it was very important. It's a very tactile experience. The book is filled with photographs and some of these newspaper clippings, a lot of the things that I had with me, because they did sort of trigger these memories. And there's a tactile aspect to it that I wanted to give the reader as much as I possibly could. Even the cover of the book is one of the pictures that was saved by my mother. And what I find so interesting about it, and I insisted with the publisher that this be the cover. And I even reference in the text, when it was in manuscript form, I referenced the picture as the cover, even though there was no cover yet. There wasn't even a publisher yet, because I knew. And it's a picture of my mother and my father, as you know from reading the book, did not have a great marriage and it did not end well. But they're dancing in this sort of 1950s Mad Men style party. And what I find so compelling is they're facing both away from the camera and away from each other. So you can't see their faces. You can only see their jaws, and they're close, but there's the separation there. And my mother has this cigarette that's hanging over his shoulder in her fingers. And the whole thing is just sort of filled with this sort of longing and this mystery and this emptiness. So, of course, a book about my mother would feature a picture of my mother where you can't see her face, right? That's sort of the whole conceit here. It's like, can I fill in that puzzle piece? And yes, being in those places was really, really critical. Now, the first place I went was the house that she was born in, and I had never been there before. So I only had stories of it, and it existed very differently in my mind than it existed in real life, because my mother's memory of it when she told me the stories was a little kid's memory. So everything seemed bigger. It was tiny, but it was very important to me to go there because I knew one thing for sure, and that's that everything that my mother did and everything she tried to cope with in life came out of the trauma of her childhood. And something really, really terrible happened in that house. And I wanted to actually see for myself what that was. I mentioned the word autopsy in the book a couple times, and people think, of course, I know what an autopsy is. It's you cut open a body. And that's true. But actually, the roots of the words mean to see for myself. And that's what an autopsy is. It's the medical examiner seeing what the hell happened with his own two eyes, or her own two eyes. So I needed to see what happened in that place. And what was so interesting was, through serendipity or through my silver-tongued natural way of talking to people, I can't say, but I was able to get into places where people didn't necessarily know me by telling them about the story and giving them some context. So that house was being worked on because somebody had just bought it to raise their own child there. And I'm writing a book about the person who was raised there who's dead, and another person who was going to be raised there who died far too early, which is part of the trauma that kicks off not only the book, but my mother's entire existence, I guess, her way of dealing with the world, which made her a pretty unique individual, I think.
I find it interesting that you basically had your mother's ashes for 3 years, never had a funeral or any really formal celebration. You're the youngest of 3 siblings, so you have an older brother, an older sister, and your older siblings didn't really care if they had a funeral or a celebration. You then basically told your older siblings about what you were doing. They didn't attend the final scene where you're spreading the ashes, but yet your brother called you at the behest of your sister because your sister was afraid of being in the book. So it's a much different, I'd say, experience than I would think most families would have. Like you said, the way that you're raised, your upbringing, and where you're at, your geography, location, and your parents have a huge impact on how you see, like you mentioned, how your wife was opposite with that. But did you expect your siblings to finally show up at the end, especially like you mentioned, it happened to coincide with your birthday?
I did not expect them to show up, and I don't blame them at all. I know them, and I know how they were raised. I know how I was raised. And if I weren't doing this book, I wouldn't have been doing this work. And I'm really glad I did. And I hope my brother and sister, if they read the book, get something out of it. But the story that I tell in the book is one of my mother's favorite quotes is, don't come visit me in the hospital because I won't come and visit you when you're in the hospital. When my mom was in the hospital, my wife said, we have to go visit her. And I gave her that quote. My wife said, that's ridiculous. She doesn't really mean that. Well, I went to the hospital, and first thing she said is, what are you doing here? And then 3 months later, maybe 4 months later, I was in the hospital and she didn't come and visit me. Does it mean she didn't love me? Of course not. No. It's the fact that she was raised to take care of herself, and she raised us to take care of ourselves. And so independence was the hallmark. So you combine that with the fact that she wasn't sentimental about funerals, about ceremony, then it doesn't surprise me that the kids were like, well, she's dead. Anything we do isn't going to bring her back, and I got work to do. It's that simple. My wife will go to any lengths to attend the funeral because it's meaningful to her. I don't know if I'm there. Like, this experience and connecting with my mother through the ashes was valuable to me. But I think if my roommate from college dies in San Diego, I'll be like, oh, that's bad news for that person. And that's it. I'm not getting on a plane. And that's Carolyn's influence on me. The pragmatism is very deep in our family. And that doesn't mean that there isn't emotion. There's a lot of emotion. It's just that it doesn't present itself as that kind of giving of self. There's too much calculus going on. So my brother and sister were busy and my mother was dead. That was it, Unfortunately, I mentioned the birthday party that we had for my mom a few weeks before she died. And she wasn't particularly sick. She was just old. And I invited the siblings there, and neither of them came to that. So they didn't have that last chance to be with her that I did, and my wife and kids did as well. And that was a nice memory. It wasn't anything particularly special. We didn't know it was going to be the last birthday, but the odds are there weren't going to be a ton more, but it wasn't special to us.
Your book is described as part memoir, part investigative journalist. What was the biggest surprise for you as you're digging back into your past? The title of the book, Offered in Secret, where you're kind of alluding to maybe your mom got secretly remarried to one of her friends at the university she was working at the time. But then you explored that path later on. And of course, he just said they were really good friends. But who knows if that's the truth or not. I kind of assume that was the biggest surprise for you since that was the title of the book. But maybe I read into that wrong. But what was the biggest surprise for you on this?
No, I think that's it. I think that is the biggest surprise. And obviously, as a surprise, we don't want to give away too much. But again, it's coming at it from a new perspective because there was a family friend who was a male who was much younger than my mother and was around after the divorce, before the divorce. And they went on walks together and they gardened together and they cooked together. And any rational person would say, oh, that's a relationship. But without my mother saying it, as a kid, you take at face value what's given to you. So there's this friend of the family, and that's all that is. And I didn't look at my mother as a sexual being, as most kids don't, even though we know we came from somewhere and that included that act, right? But it's kind of compartmentalized. So my friends would kind of tease and we would joke about it, but it wasn't a realistic option to me until I saw some of the papers left behind and started looking at some of the timelines. And this gentleman was still alive and he happened to be in Syracuse. And I did work towards trying to put the pieces together. I have an idea and it's in the book. I was able to talk to him in his office. One of my friends who read an early manuscript said that I was a person who spent his entire life talking people into doing things that they didn't want to do. And I think based on this book, that's pretty accurate because everywhere I go, including this visit with this gentleman, I get a lot of doors slammed in my face, but somehow I manage to keep going and keep pressing and get the situation to open up. That's the investigative part. I was a journalist for a number of years, but that's not really what it felt like. It felt like a kind of a noir detective because I was alone and I was, be sitting at a bar, flipping through pictures, trying to look at them in a new way and changing the order. And it did seem more like detective work than it seemed like a reportage.
I would say the primary character, of course, would be you, and then your mom. You talk about your siblings, but it seemed like you had a fairly, say, trying relationship with your father, and it forced you to kind of come to terms with that relationship, maybe more than you wanted to. Is kind of how I read the book. It seemed like it certainly brought up a lot of emotions about your father as well. I mean, you're a child of divorce, and you were fairly young when they were divorced, but it seemed like you had a lot of kind of animosity towards your father, but obviously you wouldn't be here if it wasn't for him. So there's right. Yeah. But what was I know we're talking about Mother's Day, but I think that it was pretty relevant to the story.
Yeah, no, it absolutely is relevant. I mean, our family was broken, and in a huge part, it was because of my father, the divorce, right? And so again, when I first got married, when I was engaged, my wife was saying, it seems odd to marry somebody whose father I've never met. And I was like, you don't want to meet the guy. I had heard all the terrible stories from my mother about how bad he was and how bad he treated her. And this isn't the kind of, wife beater, trailer park, drunk kind of abusive father. This was a very skilled professional man who thought he was smarter than everybody else, and most likely narcissistic and a psychopath. Honestly, I don't throw either of those terms around loosely. He was mentally abusive to my mother and the kids. But my wife kept saying, there's got to be another side to this story. You're getting the hurt wife version, but I'm sure there's a middle ground. And she happened to be on business shortly after we got married in the town where he lived, and she went and found him. Again, the detective gene runs in our family here. And so my wife called me after spending about 3 hours with him and said, he's completely insane, and in part because he acted like there was nothing wrong. It's like, oh, you're my son's wife. I haven't seen my son in 30 years, but it's like, oh yeah, oh no, that's great. Let's go out and have dinner, acting like nothing had happened, right? So I felt vindicated that she had that meeting. This is not in the book, but because it wasn't just my mom's version of things. It was the reality. And there was a moment that is seared into my brain that is in the book where I was a little kid and I was sitting at the table and they started fighting. And he started the fight by being snide. And she reacted by throwing a cup of coffee at him, trying to upset him. And we both watched him purposely not give her the satisfaction of getting upset. So he very calmly went over to the sink to try to clean off the coffee off his suit because he had just come home from work. And knowing that it would drive her crazy, much more satisfying for him to win that way than to actually react. So my mother just doubled down on the anger and went after the thing that he really did love, which was his imported Mercedes. And she took a hammer to the windshield. And I call that in the book, I call that the night of the hammer, capitals. It's a chapter in my life that I will never, ever forget. The sound of that shattering and the look on his face of actually getting at him in a way that he could feel what it felt like for her 90% of the time.
As you mentioned in the book, that was also when you had that Mercedes. This is in the time frame where you actually had to fly to Europe. You couldn't just go to a dealership in the US to buy that Mercedes. This was a pretty big deal to have that Mercedes.
Yeah. The Mercedes brand at that time, as fancy as it may be now, you didn't see them every day. It was closer to like a Bentley or something at that point. Yeah. And it was a convertible, and he was a doctor and he did all the doctor things, and she was a doctor's wife. And from the outside, people thought she was the luckiest woman in the town. And from the inside, she was just miserable. And she was willing to throw it all away. And the divorce was not pretty because she wasn't calculating enough. She was too emotional. She wasn't calculating enough to be strategic about her exit. She just demanded a divorce and gave him time to marshal his resources and basically quote unquote, win the divorce instead of being what you would hope would be a reasonable person. Oh, you're unhappy. I'm unhappy. Well, let's make sure the kids are okay. No, he was the kind of person who would say, well, I'm going to grind you under my heel and the hell with the collateral damage. So yeah, compared to my father, my mother is a saint for sure. But my mother was not your traditional mother, and she thought a certain way, and she didn't go with conventions. And it led to kind of a slightly bohemian upbringing in Syracuse, New York in the 70s. And people liked to hang out the house. My friends liked her. She was a great person, again, but did she fall down on the parenting? I think the answer is yes. The question is why, and can I understand that? Can I forgive that? And did I fall down on the being a son? Absolutely. Why? And can I forgive myself? And these are the explorations that we take on in the book.
How did your perspective on life and family evolve as a result of, investigating and going on this 1,800-mile journey?
Well, my perspective on life and family changed earlier than that when I met my wife and saw how her family worked. And at first, because it was different than mine, it seemed unnatural. But because I'm a writer, I'm an observer, and I was able to see what worked. And a lot of it did work. It wasn't perfect, but I saw the value in, I know this sounds crazy, right? Like it should be kind of, human being 101, but I saw the value in being there for other people, in offering to help, in not splitting the check, in not being so regimented and looking after yourself and letting everybody worry about themselves. And so I had already opened myself up to that. And that generosity of spirit doesn't come easy for me, but I've practiced it. It's like meditation. I've gotten better at it. I've assimilated it. So that came, I've been married now, over 25 years. So I've come a long way. And I think that helped me be a father. I was a little concerned when I found out I was having twins that I would be a father like my father was, which was very, disconnected and non-emotional. But like 99.9% people, I had that bond and that instant connection that you can't explain. It's just, oh, they're my kids. I love them. I would jump in front of a train for them, I once told my father years after he left, we were pretty estranged, but I told him that story. But I used the phrase, I would take a bullet for him. And then I said, I never got the sense that you would take a bullet for me. And he paused and said, I might try to push you out of the way of a bullet. That was as far as he could go. And my mom would have taken a bullet for me. So there's at least that. But that tells you a lot, tells you what you need to know. So my appreciation on this journey was less about family and more about what complicated people hold inside and never let out to the world. And my siblings could read this book and say, why are you telling people all this stuff? Why are you letting this out? I think it's really important to do that. I think keeping secrets bottled up, keeping emotion bottled up, it prevents people from seeing and appreciating the three-dimensionality of yourself, right? Of each other. And so my mother existed as a kind of a flat image in my mind. Yes, she was caring to a certain extent. Yes, she was loving to a certain extent. Yes, she was selfish to a certain extent. I thought I knew her, but it turned out that I knew the flat version. And then I now have gotten a 360 degree. I've walked all the way around her, if that makes sense. Like those three-way mirrors when you're trying on a suit, right? And I think that's an important way to look at the relationships in our life. It's not that you have to tell everybody everything, but the honesty of saying, these are my feelings, these are my thoughts, these are my concerns, these are my fears. I think that's really, really important. I did it for her after she was gone. In the process, I think I did it for myself. And there's a lot of people mentioned in this book, and I tell a lot of stories, but I think, and you may disagree, but I think I come off worse than anyone else in this book. Maybe not my father, but I'm way up there in terms of trying to be honest about myself and my shortcomings. And so I practice what I preach, at least.
Yeah, you kind of mentioned how people maybe thought that you were kind of being aloof because you had your mother's ashes for 3 years. But then, like you mentioned, you were taking this seriously, maybe subconsciously, because you had to find a final resting spot for her. But then I was also thinking, as you're writing this book, and this is like you coming to terms with maybe your childhood and seeing your mom as a person and not just as a mother, but then maybe you're also writing this book for like your children, because your children are still in school, so they're going to see you as their dad, but at some point they're also going to have to go through this. So there seems like there's a lot of subconscious things working in this book where maybe it started out about your discovery, but there's a lot of other layers.
Yeah. I've tried raising the kids because I'm self-employed. I spend a lot of time at home. I spend a lot of time with the kids, and also because of the type of work that I do. I write and direct films. I'm a journalist. I do video projects. I do music, and it's a lot of creative stuff seems at some level sort of more fundamentally childlike. And so I did try to hold on to the idea that like you can connect with kids through honesty and having them be a part of what you do. Hey, come on in. I'm doing this voiceover thing. I need you to do some applause for me. So kind of get them involved in a way that, my father was a plastic surgeon. He left at 5:00 in the morning wearing a suit and came home at midnight wearing the same suit. I hardly ever saw him. I had images of him as an adult with a capital A. And I don't think my kids have ever had that. Not that I'm one of them. I'm certainly a parent, but the way we joke, the way we talk about things like belief and the ceremonies and things like that, I think they're ahead of the game in terms of not having to worry about me. But they are mentioned in the book, and I think even in the last line of the book, saying basically, don't do this for me. It's done. I've done it. Find your own way to make peace when I leave. Don't steal my idea. And don't visit me in the hospital.
Right, don't visit me in the hospital, right. One of the things I thought was interesting was that you mentioned in the book how your mom grew up in the Depression era, and that you think that you grew up a lot more similar to your mom, or at least had more in common with her childhood than what your kids have with you.
Oh, yeah.
Same thing I'm 41, but I was obviously like pre-smartphone and all this stuff. But how much different, do you, one, think you had a better childhood than your kids had? It's certainly different, but two, just how much different is it between when you grew up and when your kids grew up?
It's amazing how different it is. And I think my kids have had a great childhood, in part because they grew up on this farm that I have with animals and space and not a lot of people around. So they do have that sort of outside life. We had to make our own fun. And so the bar for what was fun was pretty low, And so like the idea of, there's a game I didn't play. It's before our time, but stickball. Stickball, you didn't even have a bat. You had a stick and a ball, and you somehow made some version of baseball in the street out of that, or opening up a fire hydrant in the city and getting wet on a summer day. Those are simple pleasures, and they're pretty low on the pleasure level. But if that's all you got, that's all you got. I think the world is more open to my kids. Certainly from a financial standpoint, they've had lots of opportunities that I didn't have. One of the things that I compare my mother's life to mine is not only having to make your own fun, but also I went from being a doctor's son to being completely broke as a family kind of overnight. And so I had that lack of financial security that my mother had because she was in the Depression and kept, it didn't help that she had that and brought it to our conditions when my father left. But that made things a little bit stressful too. And that's certainly obviously something that we want to keep away from my kids. My wife and I are both self-employed, so it's been feast or famine, project to project. But we've kept the lights on, and the kids have no idea whether finances are tight or not, So that's one of the odd things about my mother is I think she got some relief explaining her financial worries to whoever was around, which was me, because my siblings are older and we're kind of off and running. So I was learning about a negative balance in a checkbook and being scared by it so that she could feel a little bit better about it, even though I didn't know why she was doing it and it wasn't changing the account balance. options, you know? So it was very impractical. Even though I say she's a practical woman, she felt better knowing that I knew what a negative meant in the checkbook and that I would not be able to sleep at night because there's negative money in the bank account, right? But she got through it too. Everybody does. But I do think that if I were a kid now, I would think that the creativity that I had with my friends as kids would blossom with the technology. So we would do the same kinds of things, but more, bigger, and better, as opposed to just be distracted by a million screens and a million TikToks or whatever. I think that's kind of in you. You either want to make stuff or make stuff happen or you don't. And so I don't think that changes no matter how many options there are. I could be wrong.
Right. Yeah, you were mentioning that you, even in the 70s, you were doing like movies, right? Home movies. And you had, was it like the 8-track cartridge, whatever you were using?
Super 8 movies.
Right.
Super 8 films,
so
yeah.
Can you imagine growing up now with an iPhone and you'd have more editing, your iPhone has more editing power and camera power than what they were doing in Star Wars in the late 70s or whatever, right?
I know. It's incredible. Yeah, it boggles my mind. And I think that me and my friends would be all over it. I'm going to see them this weekend. We're having a little bit of a reunion, so I'm going to ask them what they think about that. In fact, there's a chance that one of my guys, who's mentioned in the book, has digitized those Super 8 movies and we can watch them. And that will be something. They didn't have any sound. We had to figure out how to do sound. So we would have a cassette recorder and we'd do music and dialogue. It was a big mess. But yeah, the technology is really amazing. And I embrace it all. I think that's partly, it's my creative bent. It's my interest to some degree. And it also, I think it keeps me like a younger person mentally than my actual physical age. And I think that's really important.
Right. You'd be like Logan Paul or was it Mr. Beast? Didn't they both start at like 10 or 11 on their YouTube channel? And now Mr. Beast has basically the biggest platform of any celebrity in the world.
It's incredible, right? Yeah. The distribution channels have been opened up, right? So it used to be, who controls the means of production. Then it became who controls the means of distribution. And now all bets are off on both fronts, right? So it's like you can get it out there. And if it's good, people are going to see it. And it'll go viral and they'll hire you to be on Saturday Night Live or something, We had no idea.
Technology can be good or bad. Like you can be on your phone all day as a kid and just being on TikTok or YouTube watching a bunch of crazy stuff that's probably not good for you. Or you could be like Mr. Beast or be like Logan Paul and actually be building a business. And isn't Mr. Beast like the first YouTube billionaire? And he's barely 20. I think he turned 26 yesterday.
Yeah.
Like that's just insanity. If you could use it for good or you can use it for distraction.
Yeah. Well, I'll tell you a quick story. How things change, how they stay the same. So when we were kids and we had these Super 8 cameras, which were real film, right? So it exposed to light and it get an image. So we read about this way that you could cover up half the screen, half the lens, keep it dark, not expose that half, and then film something, rewind the film inside the camera, cover up the other half, and do basically a double exposure. And so our idea was that we were going to do like what you've seen in movies where a same actor plays twins, right? So we couldn't make it work. We would have half the screen would be black and there'd be the person standing near the barn and the other half. It never worked. Cut to like 100 years later, my son is applying to a college and has to do a video and introduce himself, which is a big thing that some of these colleges do now. So we were talking about it and I said, why don't we do a talk show where you interview yourself? So you'll be the host of the show and you'll be the guest of the show and you'll have different clothes on and we'll time it out. And he's like, you can do that? I'm like, yeah, absolutely. Of course. Now you can do it easy. And we put it together and it was like everything that I would have hoped for that Super 8 movie 40 years earlier. And it worked perfectly. And I was really proud of it.
Yeah, like basically like the childhood that you wanted is the childhood your kid is getting right now because you were all in. Not to mention, I mean, you're still, a director right now. So this would have been heaven for you if you were born,
absolutely.
I guess a generation later.
Right, yeah. But then if my father were into it, then I wouldn't be interested in it. So that's just the way that works, right?
Right, that's right. Whatever your parents were into, you do the opposite,
exactly,
right?
Yeah.
You gotta rebel against the man or whatever.
No matter what, no matter where it is, even if it comes from having rebelled, it's like, no, we're on the right side now. No, it's like a tennis match, just goes back and forth.
So I guess I was curious what your mom would have. I mean, I guess this is just conjecture because your mom's passed away, but what do you think your mom, how she would have reacted to this pilgrimage you took? You mentioned how she's like, don't visit me in the hospital.
Yeah.
Because I won't visit you.
Yeah.
What do you think she would have thought about you taking this 1,800-mile journey and kind of her honor to dispose of her ashes in a proper place?
That's a great question. I think my mom's, I think, secretly wanted to be a star. She loved Shirley Temple when she was a kid. And I think there was a part of her, she didn't have any talent, but I think she just wanted to be in the spotlight. So I think the fact that we're talking about her, the fact that there's a book with her on the cover, the fact that there's a book where she's the entire subject, that would be very flattering to her. She might argue, she might get defensive, she might deny some of the things, some of the conclusions that I've come to. That doesn't mean they're wrong. That means that they would sting a little bit. But I'd like to think if there's a heaven and she's looking down on it, she'd be like, well, this is one of the best things my son has ever written, and I inspired it. And she'd be proud of that. If she knows anything about writing, because I got to tell you, when I get galleys of my books and I have to read them one last time for an edit, most books, all my books until this one, there's a pit in my stomach and I just kind of looking at it and going, it could be better. It should be better. I don't like this. I don't like that. It's just very self-critical. When I got the galley of this and I started reading it, it was almost like somebody else had written it. Like I picked it up and I didn't have any of that defensiveness. I kind of got lost in it. And maybe that's practice makes perfect and it's the most recent thing. I've just gotten better as a writer, but I don't think so. I think that there's something that's so sharp about these memories and these discoveries, and that the challenge of describing them has a level of detail and a level of truth to them that my other stuff doesn't touch. And so I can thank her for that. She helped me do some of my best writing and she made me who I am. But I think she'd also say it's a big fuss, but she'd also thank me for knowing that it was the right place to bury her, which we will keep a secret. I think that's for the readers to discover, right? But hopefully it makes sense as you think back about what you read. You're like, it was kind of leading to this in a way, in a very subtle way. Did you feel that way or?
I mean, as you laid it out, I guess I wasn't surprised.
Yeah.
It's kind of the build up for it. I really didn't know much about Syracuse. I've never actually been to upstate New York. I've only been as far as New York City.
You haven't missed
and
much.
So, and when you kind of were describing some of the canals and some of the history, then it kind of made sense without giving too much away. But I think Syracuse, unless you go to university there, I don't think it's one of those cities that, unless you're from that area, that you're thinking about like, oh, I got to check out Syracuse.
No, there's no reason to ever be there. I really, I've been there a few times. Like, I don't have any family left there, which is kind of odd. It's like when you go to your hometown and you have to get a hotel, that's a little sort of unsettling, particularly since I've found that in America, most people don't move too far away, or at least don't settle down too far away from kind of where they came from and where their kin are, And again, my mother wasn't like that. She wasn't from there. My father wasn't from there. We kind of landed there and then we landed somewhere else. So it's a little bit different experience, but I do not recommend going to Syracuse, although the university is pretty amazing. And when I went back recently, because my daughter went to SU for a year, so I dropped her off, showed her around. I did have a fondness for it that I didn't think I would have. It's a Rust Belt town that's doing its best to kind of come back into the 21st century. And it's kind of sweet. And the buildings and the architecture, if you know the Northeast, it's not New York City, but if it is, it's the part, down by the docks. It's the meat packing district with the brick warehouses. That's all of Syracuse. So not a lot of skyscrapers, but I have a soft spot in my heart for it. And I imagine that maybe we'll sell a bunch of books there because not a lot gets written about Syracuse. So I think there is some pride there.
I read this stat, this is years ago, but it said that 75% of people live within something around like 50 miles where they grew up, and only 25% of Americans even have a passport. So, I mean, I think maybe in today's day and age, where due to economics, people might be moving a little bit more, a little further than they used to do. But yeah, generally speaking, people pretty much live fairly close to where they grew up. So
yeah. It is kind of amazing to me that I was able to log 1,800 miles. I did go to another country. I went to Canada, but Canada, New York City is actually further away from Syracuse than Montreal is, which is kind of an amazing statistic, right? But I wound my way up there and around, and it was a circuitous route. But a lot of miles in not that many days. And a new place each day and a new way to look at my mother. So the structure of the book is, as you know, it's divided up by place, and it's not exactly chronological order because each place unfolds a memory that tells different aspects of my life with my mother. And then we kind of snap back into the present and go to the next place. So it's a somewhat complicated timeline, but I think narratively it flows really well because you're kind of just on a road trip with me.
What do you hope the readers will take away from your book, Offered in Secret?
The comparison that my publishers have made is with the book Eat, Pray, Love. And we should be lucky to sell the number of copies that Eat, Pray, Love sold. So it's not a comparison of popularity or even quality, but of an essence. And here's the essence of Eat, Pray, Love. A person who's not you went on this phenomenal trip and told you about it. Well, why do you care about that? You're not them. They're not you. Well, you care about it because it's a journey of introspection, healing, and discovery that you can apply to yourself. So even if you don't go where that author went, didn't experience what that author experienced, you can superimpose those emotional needs, wants, desires, and complications on your own life. So I feel the same way about Offered in Secret. Hardly anybody is Carolyn Connolly's son. There's two of us, and she has a daughter. And there's a lot more readers than the three of us. And some may know Carol, some of my old high school buddies or whatever, but most won't. The trick is, can they see the struggle that I have to really appreciate and understand my mother as a person, as a whole and flawed human being? And can they bring that to their own sense of their own relationship? And I think the details somehow make that actually more universal. If I wrote a theoretical book about how you should love, forgive, and treat your mother like a person, it would be an abstraction. And maybe there'd be, here's 10 steps to take. And maybe it'd be like a business book, But those don't really land. I think what lands is really the empathy of putting yourself in my shoes, going on that journey, finding those surprises, and then taking it back with you and saying, that connects with me. I had that feeling about my mother. Now, maybe your mom's still alive and you want to talk to her about this book. Or maybe you're about to lose your mother and you don't know how to handle it. You don't know how to approach it. Or maybe you've just lost a parent or lost a long time ago and you never feel really reconciled and you miss her every day. All those areas can be informed by this journey. And as I said, there is something about being able to take the journey on behalf of other people. Other people have full-time jobs and couldn't possibly take the time out to do this kind of soul searching. So maybe it's a shortcut to that. Let me show you how to search your soul so that you don't actually have to do all these hard steps. You can just get the kind of main line of this is the thought process and then apply that to your own thinking. I've been asked by the publisher to write up some book club questions so that people can read it together and share. And these are the kind of things that we've thought about. It's not the specifics, it's the universality of the specifics. So that's what I hope people get in a better connection with their parents. I hope they're more forgiving. I hope that they can see in this great cycle of life that we all start off trying to find our way and we don't have the answers. And life doesn't give us the answers just because, I don't know, we turn 35 or we get pregnant or whatever. That's not where the answers come from. You got to find them.
just kind of mentioned, the cycle and the circles of life. Since this is a Mother's Day special, now that you're a father, you have a wife who's a mother, your mother has passed on. How has your relationship with Mother's Day kind of changed?
Well, there's a parallel, because one of the things about Mother's Day is, can you live up to the expectations, and do the expectations overwhelm you, right? So just like when my wife was asking me, how are we going to celebrate? What are we going to do with these ashes? Where would your mother want to be buried? Making it bigger and bigger so that you're almost afraid to be wrong. I think Mother's Day suffers a lot from that. Maybe it's the small gestures. Maybe it's not about, is this piece of jewelry nice enough? Is it show how much I love her? Maybe it's more about slowing down and connecting. Now you've caught me on a bad year, because I'm actually going to be out of town on Father's Day. So that's not, I would say Mother's Day. So that's not ideal, hanging out with my buddies on Mother's Day. My mother would say that all those holidays were made up in, Hallmark holidays. So I also have that. She was even barely into birthdays. She liked Christmas. But again, because I'm a writer, I try to look at things from other people's viewpoints. And so I try, if I'm a good husband, it's in part because I see what my wife does and realize that it's not just because she feels like it or because she's a woman or any of these other things. It's because she's making a conscious decision that somebody has to do this and it's getting done. And so to take time and help or admire or thank on a daily basis, regardless of what day it is I think the key to success in a marriage. It's really being a partner and not hoping somebody else will do the cruddy stuff. It's noticing, it's the golden rule of treating other people the way you want to be treated. There is something to be said for that that's better and bigger than Mother's Day. Having said that, you should buy the book and give it to your mother for Mother's Day.
Thank you, Stuart Connelly, the author of Offered in Secret, for joining us today. I want to respect your time, so I just want you to let people know where they can find your book, get a hold of you, etc., whatever information you want to provide. And then secondly, leave us with a final thought on this Mother's Day.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm all the normal social media, and my website is stuartconnelly.com if you want to drop by. The book is, the book is coming out Mother's Day, but the publisher did a kind of a fun thing and let the ebook release out early. So ebook currently available on Amazon and everywhere where you'd get your ebooks, or available for pre-order from Red Hawk Publications, or wait until this Sunday, Mother's Day, and it will be available on Amazon for order in trade paperback. So we're real excited about that. And last thoughts on this Mother's Day. I can say without any uncertainty that I got to know my mother simply by spending the time alone, really, really thinking about her. And so I think any mother, any father, any person out there, that's the greatest gift that you can give to somebody. The greatest tribute is to try to actually deeply think about another person. And I think the world, and certainly our personal lives, would be a lot better if, instead of checking things off or going through the motions or hurrying to the next thing, we took some contemplative time with the people we loved or the people who brought us into this world and gave them their fair due. So the 8 days that I spent on the road, looking at those pictures over and over, reading the divorce decree, looking at those odd newspaper clippings that she saved, is the highest form of honor I think that I can pay somebody. And if I were to make the world's rules, I would think that that's a better way to have a funeral for somebody than to go through the motions and do what everybody else has done, and then be done in 45 minutes, go to the grave, put a flower down, and then have brunch. And I really believe that.
My dear friends, that is it for this episode of El Podcast. Once again, if you're not yet subscribed, please subscribe on YouTube as well as Rumble. You can also find us on Spotify and Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts from. We thank you all from the bottom of our hearts for watching and listening, and we will see you on the next episode.